Welcome to everyone joining me, Amanda Williams, Archivist at Warwickshire County Record Office, for this digital presentation. We tested this method of delivery while COVID restrictions stopped us meeting because we wanted to offer an open window whilst the door was firmly shut. But we hope the presentation continues to be a useful addition to our other in-person talks that we give. Of course, the beauty of the virtual talk for you is that you can now sit back and relax and perhaps enjoy some refreshments whilst watching the presentation. And might I suggest a mince pie if you're watching at Christmas time? Obviously, there can't be a question and answer session at the end of this talk, but if you do have any questions or comments, please email us at recordoffice@warwickshire.gov.uk or take a look at the Our Warwickshire website. This is a website initiated by Heritage Warwickshire, of which we are a part, and you can see not only a wealth of information and photographs of past Warwickshire, but you can add your own articles and comments. Visit www.ourwarwickshire.org.uk. Now, don't worry if you didn't get any of that down. If you've got a pen and paper to hand, or you've got your phone with a camera on it, we'll put those addresses up at the end. During this presentation, you're going to hear me talking about various traditions and customs celebrated down the year in the UK, some of which are represented by documents and photographs of places and events in Warwickshire. I'm going to trace each event in order of the calendar year, a year, it seems to me, crammed with any excuse for a community knees up. You're going to hear mainly from me, but you're also going to hear the voices of people who in the 1990s took part in Warwickshire Library's Warwickshire Lives, which was a project to document a Warwickshire past fast disappearing. So my thanks also go to Louise Essex. She's the local history librarian, for lending us the audio tapes to digitise, thereby conserving them, but also allowing us to pick out our choice snippets for this presentation. Because of the extraordinarily difficult times we've experienced due to coronavirus, we wanted to put together a talk on more light-hearted matters, and this fitted in with a chance to develop the Christmas show and tell that I run and that we've done for the last couple of years. So you're going to hear about some, but not all, English traditions and festivities that were celebrated in Warwickshire until relatively recent times. Before we get stuck in, though, I want to just thank fellow archivists Carolyn Ewing. Carolyn provided the images, or some of the images, and undertook a digital tour of the building, which we wanted to show as part of this talk, but unfortunately we didn't have time. But also Sharon Foreman, who, without you wouldn't be seeing any of this. She has digitised the audio tapes. She has put all of this together, spliced it, redone it for me several times. And so it's been a huge job that she's undertaken. So we're going to begin as close to the new year as we can. It's a new year for us, but it's not quite as simple as this for people living in England prior to 1752, when officially a new year began on March the 25th. But I need to clarify this before we begin. So it's known and documented that Henry VIII celebrated a new year on January the 1st, when he received gifts from his courtiers and foreign diplomats. I owe Lucy Worsley for that one because I saw it on one of her programmes. I find no document celebrating the changeover of the year on the 25th of March. So when we think about the 25th of March, New Year, I think we're thinking in purely administrative terms, very much like our financial year in April, which pre-1752 was also the 25th of March. The financial year was moved at the same time as the calendar year. However, in order that 11 days of tax revenue wasn't lost to the Crown, the financial year was moved to the 6th of April. Now, this means that the old year really doesn't sound as much fun as the 1st of January, New Year. So we're going to begin our first festival after the New Year. We'll begin not with our New Year, but with a rather dignified sounding event. The 2nd of February is also known as Candlemas and was the feast of the presentation of Jesus at the temple and of the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Historically, it marked the end of the Christmastide, when all the decorations would be taken down. Imagine keeping your tinsel and tree up until February. Candles were blessed in church, a practice frowned upon after the Reformation as superstitious, with a procession before Mass. Candles were also placed in windows, representing the idea of Jesus, the light of the world. But, as with so many of these celebrations, there was a much older pagan element, a festival of light to signal the midpoint of winter, halfway between the winter solstice, the shortest day, and the spring equinox. It doesn't surprise us, then, that there was a tradition of lighting candles and placing them in windows to scare away evil spirits during the darkest and longest of nights. And there were plenty of other superstitions around this event, some related to weather, some to the parting of ways or the end of life. And we do like our superstitions and traditions, but perhaps not so much for Candlemas. It seems lighting candles to scare away evil spirits was kept to Halloween instead. As far as I'm aware, at Warwickshire County Record Office we have no obvious reference to a procession with blessed candles, although I wonder if I were to look in church wardens' accounts whether we might see the purchase of the candles, or maybe there are references in letters and diaries to superstitions. But I think another event took place on Candlemas Day, as I've seen reference to it not only in our own records, but also in the documents at other record offices. In Anne Biker's settlement on charity, £2 was to be paid to poor ancient maids and widows of the parish of Frankton on Candlemas. This is reflected in Devon Record Office, where Candlemas gifts are accounted for in Charity Commissioner records, and reference is also made to giving to the poor in other areas around the country. So Candlemas seems to have been a sedate affair, perhaps why at most this day is solely restricted to the church calendar. But let us move on to a more boisterous occasion. Shrove Tuesday, or Pancake Day as many of us think of it now, was a day during Shrove Tide, the 4 days before Lent, when opportunity was given to eat up all the foods forbidden to good Christians during the time of Lent, the 40 days that Jesus spent in the desert. Shrove comes from the word shrive, to absolve. I suppose we've got to go back before the Reformation again and Henry VIII to understand what this day meant. For Anglo-Saxons, Shrove Tuesday was the day for confession, followed by the absolution of sins. A bell would be rung as a call to confession, known as the shriving bell. It also became known as the pancake bell, and is still rung in some places today. It was also the day, and still is for some, to finalise what you intended to sacrifice over Lent. During the Middle Ages, Lent meant abstaining from eating meat, eggs, fats, and restricting your diet to bread, fish, and vegetables. Fish, on account of the 2 disciples being fishermen, were allowed. The fish would be salted for preservation. Dairy produce, such as eggs and cheese, would be replaced by almonds, but butter and milk were still allowed. Spices were surprisingly also allowed, but for most I doubt would have been affordable. Alongside foods, the sombreness of Lent meant giving up dancing and sports amongst other pastimes. So Shrovetide really was the last opportunity for not only eating the good stuff, but for all other merriment making. And no wonder the French call Shrove Tuesday Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, a day of indulgence and carnival-like celebration before the austerity of Lent set in. In the UK, the community came together to celebrate too. According to the English Heritage website, meat such as bacon would be eaten up on Collop Monday, a collop being a thin slice of meat. And if you think Halloween is bad, children had 2 days of fun during Shrove time. On Mondays they might be out singing, once, twice, thrice I give thee warning, please to make some pancakes again tomorrow morning. And Shroving or Lent crocking on Shrove Tuesday, or possibly the night before, when they would knock on neighbours' doors and sing, we become a Shroving for a piece of pancake or a bite of bacon or a little truckle of cheese of your own making. Sometimes these children would bring shards of crockery or stones with them to throw at householders who refused to give them anything. On Shrove Tuesday, the shriving bell would ring calling the faithful to church. As the eggs, butter and stocks of fat needed to be used, pancakes were made, and incidentally became a tradition that stuck fast in England and therefore wasn't quashed when England broke from Rome in the 16th century. In some parishes, food and sport were combined in a pancake race, said to have originated in 1445, when a housewife, supposedly making pancakes in Olney, Buckinghamshire, heard the church bell calling the parish to church and being late, raced, pancake in hand, tossing it as she ran to stop it from burning. Olney still celebrates with a pancake race to this day. For other communities, it was a last chance to let off steam with a game of mob football, which seemingly dates back to the 17th century. The Highways Act of 1835 banned the playing of football in the public highway, so it died out in most places, but not Atherstone, where it's still played today, and it isn't for the faint-hearted.
The Shrovetide football, yes. Well, that was quite an event, and we had to have a day off from school because you'd finish school while the ball was still being knocked about, and so you'd get a half holiday from school. It was a great big ball. It was, not an ordinary football, but a big ball. Men from who organised the event, they'd bring round this football to the schools and give the children a kick in the mornings. That was great. That was a good thing. And then in the afternoon they'd kick it about from 3 o'clock till about 5, and then somebody would smuggle it away. But we were very pleased to get half a day to go and see it, And the people, no end of people came, you see, from Badders and all those villages round. It was quite an event, you see, Alison football. And somebody important from the Commentary pantomime would come and throw out the ball, and that was always, and throw out a few pennies or sweets or something. But my father wouldn't let me go into any scrums, It was very protective.
So what kind of form did it take? It seems quite a rough affair.
Oh, it did. Yes, the people with shoes were next day or the evening. You'd have all the odd shoes about and shirts peeled off. People. Oh, yes, they were rough. Yes. In fact, they used to board all the shops up. You see, and in the morning, the carpenters were very busy boarding these shops up. And I remember when the cars came along and come in the office and say to me, "You're expecting a CD?" So I said, "No, it's the Shrovetide football game." It's quite, yeah. And it gets on the television now,
As the year progressed, parishes would make ready for the village wake. Now, a wake was a great time for celebrating, but we're not talking about the watching through the night over someone who's recently died. Each parish church was dedicated to a saint, and either on the saint's feast day or the day of the church dedication, the parish would celebrate with a wake. Many saints' days are described as feast days, and the medieval calendar was chock full of saints' days, so I do wonder how much time off feasting and frolicking went on through the year, or whether actually the wake alleviated this problem for the economy by ensuring that communities only celebrated their own patron saint. I definitely need to do a bit more research on this. But back to wakes. Church services began at sunset on the Saturday, and a night of prayer would ensue, called a vigil, or, due to the lateness of the hour, a wake, from the Old English waken, or possibly wyken, meaning wakefulness, sleeplessness, watching. And we can see a theme evolving here. Alongside the religious observance came the celebrations, which would involve sporting games, dancing, and of course drinking.
We always had wakes years ago, you know. We had a wake here, but Bilton Wake always came first, so we spent our money at Bilton on the roundabouts and whatnot, you know.
So they had a fair in
Yes, always at the wakes. Bilton came before, that was the village, you know, about a mile and a half from us. They came before us, their wake, but after May, they were in May, their wake, so that's where we used to spend our money.
But all this had to follow on from the rush bearing and church service. Rush bearing involved collecting rushes and strewing them on the floor of the parish church. Remember, this is a really old tradition when parish church floors would have been compacted earth beneath the congregation's feet. The rushes would promote a sweet smell, as often specific herbs and grasses were collected for the purpose. It also provided a sort of insulation and was beneficial from a cleanliness point of view. I suppose it helped prevent a muddy quagmire, kept mud from shoes, and could be brushed away after the celebrations with all the detritus brought in on the boots. The rushes would be brought in on carts, decorated with garlands and flowers, ribbons, etc., and piled high. Alongside the cart, people would accompany it by singing and morris dancing. I said this country always seems to have enjoyed an ease up.
What we used to have was Wake Sunday, and it used to be a big parade, and I was in the guides and the brownies and the boys' brigade always used to parade. They used to meet by the village hall and always march to church on Wake Sunday, which was a nice thing, you know. When the wake was coming, of course it took a long while because they had to come from Coventry to Itchington. And when the men had been coming home from work, we used to stand outside and say to these men, "Is the wake coming?" And they say, "Yes, it's just got to Marton." Well, then we used to start to go and to meet it, because they used to bring the donkeys with them for donkey rides in the village. And the donkeys were the last thing. They all come right the last of the fair. We used to walk as far as we could get to see this wake coming, because it was a big thing as a kiddie. And then the wake lasted 3 days. The main night was Wednesday night, when everybody went with the mum and dad. And I can remember going to all the wakes when as a kid with my mum and dad. And you sort of met everybody and knew everybody, and really great do.
As wakes became more boisterous, they were moved from the Sunday to the Saturday. But Mondays were reserved for public entertainment, and you could hear bands and play games and go to the fun fair. But where did wakes go? They seem to have been assimilated in a regular summer holiday. The Industrial Revolution was really responsible for bringing about the first changes, as factories and collieries would close for a week for the festivities. So wakes did continue into the 20th century, but really, once schools cemented a 6 weeks holiday, wakes were all but lost to time. But not to worry, because we had May Day.
Well, we'd go and pick daisies, make the chains, and dance round the maypole, you know, all us girls and boys and that.
You know, we used to love May Day. Yes, we used to go for miles, you know, round singing at the houses. And, of course, I was dressed up and in this mail cart, all flowers. We used to go early to the school. And after then I was sort of maid of honour, you know, with the May Day. And we used to go and decorate this, well, it was like a mail cart, you know, decorated all with flowers. And we used to walk right over to Corston and all the big houses round. Sometimes we had milk and buns. And you know, however cold it was, we always wanted to take our coats off because we were in white dresses, you see. Oh, it didn't matter whether it was cold or not, we'd got to show our dresses. Yes, we walked a long way. And then we used to have tea at the school, you see. And then what money was over, they used to divide it up. The Queen always had so much, and the rest was divided up with us. And we always reckoned to spend that.
May Day is the day the nation would celebrate the return of spring. It screams ancient paganism, doesn't it? And actually, we know the ancient Greeks and Romans held similar festivals. We have plenty of photographs of maypoles and dancers, May Queens, etc. The maypoles would be decorated with garlands and ribbons, and people would collect the wild flowers and green branches for weaving into garlands. Dancing would begin, supposedly evolving from fertility dances for crops and livestock, the abundance of which was so important to rural communities. And again, there are accompanying superstitions. Some people might wash their face in the morning dew of May to beautify the skin. It's really not surprising that the Puritans didn't hold with May Day and so did their best to do away with it. But they didn't quite. It did die away slowly though, presumably with urbanisation. My father recalls my grandmother describing dancing around the maypole as a child outside Sutton Coldfield Town Hall, but there hasn't been a maypole in Sutton for many a long year. If May Day heralded the arrival of spring with new growth, then harvest brings the agricultural year to a close. After bringing in the harvest, it was time to enjoy some of the fruits of their labour, and agricultural labourers and hired help would sit down with squires and farmers to hopefully a hearty repast. Thereafter, the celebrations would begin in earnest, with the usual dancing, games, and no doubt a plentiful supply of alcoholic beverages.
Oh yes, we used to have a bit of a rave up after the eye-making feast and the last load of the harvest was all brought in. Oh yes, oh we've had all that, yeah. That big harvest supper. Then when all the harvest was brought in, and then it was got to have a threshing machine to thresh the corn out, and that was another a big event in them days.
It must have been a raucous occasion, for one harvest time down south was described as being unrestrained riot and excess. And as a result of these excesses, the 19th century church successfully moved to restore order, centering the event around church services and the more dignified aspects of Harvest Festival.
And the Harvest Festival at the church was very, very nice. I should think everyone, the farmers' wives, the church it used to be decorated beautiful. And I should think there was everything, even to loaves of bread, put on the altar. It was really very nice.
As before, Christians worked an existing celebration into its worship, and I think most of us will recognise that harvest, from Old English meaning autumn, comes from a pre-Christian era and one full of symbolism. Corn dollies were a practice dating back into the mists of time, but said to relate to the last of the harvest being taken in, woven from the last corn sheaves thought to contain the spirit of the corn, an ancient goddess. These dollies would be given names such as the maiden, the neck, or the mare. The woven objects were supposed to be kept above the hearth to ensure the success of the following year's harvest. In very early days, a hare would be sacrificed too, presumably one found in the corn being harvested. But this altered to a corn-woven hare, hung in farmhouses, representative of the goddess of the grain. Hares would evolve into a variety of figures. By Michaelmas, the 29th of September, the harvest was expected to be in. If produce was plentiful, then I'm sure celebrations would have been joyous. However, a poor harvest meant a difficult year was ahead, and this must have dampened spirits. But still, if a rough harvest was had, then perhaps we can still throw caution to the wind, and even if we're not buying, we can enjoy a visit to the local fair. When we think of fairs, most of us will think of the fun fair. Some might think of the school fairs and others trade fairs. All this makes sense when we go back to its origins. During the Middle Ages, if you wanted a fair, you had to have a charter from the king granting you the right. We call these charter fairs. Alongside a fair, grants were also given for markets, but you could be granted a fair without a market, and presumably vice versa. Many fairs and markets today will be as a direct result from such a charter. Trinity Great Fair in Coventry, which is now the Godiva Festival, and Warwick and Stratford Mops, to name just three. Warwick had a fair bestowed on it by a charter of Edward III, stipulating that the fair was to be held in the town's centre. It was held on the Friday and Saturday following the 12th of October and was possibly linked to the end of the harvest. Local fairs were also granted at Southam, Banbury, Tewkesbury and Ulster. If we were to visit these fairs, we would probably think we were visiting the market, but they tended to be annual events lasting 2 to 3 days, and so you can see why entertainment would be ongoing around you, and traders would be selling goods which would bring buyers, and it's a chance for the local population to make a little money. You can put entertainment on and work a crowd. You could sell food and drink from a stall maybe, or even hawk your wares. In the early days, it was the wealthy landowner that benefited most from these fairs. They were the consumers of fine goods that wouldn't ordinarily be available locally, so things like spices and wax, preserved fish and cloth, all coming from international merchants, and it was part of the experience of the fair. It meant these wealthy lords were cutting out the middlemen, the London merchants. There was also a profit to be made if you hosted such an event, as the lord would exact rents and taxes for trading and stalls, etc. But remember, fairs were regulated by the king, and if you want a charter, you have to pay, so the crown got something out of it too. Over 2,200 charters granting fairs and markets were issued by English kings between 1200 and 1270. The terms market and fairs were used interchangeably, but there were differences. Markets tended to be held daily in more populous towns and cities, weekly in rural areas, and they sold local produce. And fairs, on the other hand, was a set event in the year and were almost always associated with a religious festival. High-value goods and non-perishable items like farm tools, homewares, furniture, rugs and ceramics were traded, and remember the spices and wax, etc. And although the primary purpose for the fair was trade, there would be plenty of entertainment to be had, such as music, dancing and perhaps a tournament. Sounds vaguely familiar? The merchants visiting fairs toured the country, so fairs were always held on the days set for them on a circuit route, probably close in time to another nearby fair. The most important fairs in England in the 13th century were Stamford during Lent, St Ives at Easter, Boston in July, Winchester in September, and Northamptonshire in November. These drew in international merchants from places like Flanders, Norway, Germany and France, and a huge amount of money would be exchanged. Such places established a pie powder court to deal with arising disputes and also govern the event, so overseeing law and order and imposing and regulating weights and measures whilst keeping an eye on legal contracts. These huge concerns would be interspersed with the secondary charter fairs, such as Stourbridge. This would go on to be the biggest fair in Europe towards the end of the Middle Ages, possibly because it was geographically central. And then presumably local lesser fairs like Warwick and Stratford would grow up along the routes. Fairs also operated as employment centres, when local labourers and employers could meet in a social setting. You can't read a Thomas Hardy novel without finding yourself at the hiring fair, where agricultural labourers milled about drinking, and incidentally, wives were known to have been sold. Thomas Hardy, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, eulogises the hiring fair, probably because he recognises its decline. Warwick and Stratford were established as hiring fairs, where labourers were hired for a week, hence the runaway mop the following week, when, having worked provisionally for the week, worker and employee could formally bind the contract for the year, or if they didn't get on too well, they would go their separate ways. A token wage was given at the runaway mop for the week worked, which the employee could then spend at the fair. And why the mop? It is thought to mean a piece of cloth with a symbol on it, like a badge that advertised the labourer's trade. At the fair it was commonplace for an ox or pig to be roasted, so visiting fairgoers could eat whilst warming themselves near the fire. And in Warwick this continues, with the first piece of meat auctioned off to raise money. Stratford too continues as a pleasure fair.
Every August, for August Bank Holiday week, so that was when the holidays were then, they used to come and we used to have the fair. They used to bring the crocks and the merry-go-rounds for the kiddies. But I will say, after they had gone that week, you wouldn't know that a fair had been on that field. They used to leave the field as they found it. It used to be exactly as it was when they come in. If it had been a bit wet, there might be some wheel marks for the carriages, you know, where they'd gone. But otherwise, it's very good.
Fairs went into a sort of decline when those wealthy landowners stopped purchasing goods from traders and went straight to the merchants. And this was because trading communication had improved so substantially with Europe. The English merchant class managed to firmly establish themselves in big cities like London. So the large chartered fairs were no longer really needed. Neither did central government have so much control of the localities, which meant people could trade privately all year round, which was more convenient to them. Canals and railways also put a nail in the coffin of the trading goods side of the enterprise. But fairs did evolve, so whilst the Industrial Revolution put a stranglehold on the trading of goods and hiring of employees, it was also the catalyst for a new type of entertainment, the fun fair with all its rides. The medieval chartered fairs survive today as fun fairs and festivals, and we still have Warwick Mop, the Godiva Festival. I don't know if Birmingham still has its onion fair. My mum visited it a long time ago, though she says an onion wasn't to be had, as the entertainment side had then been hived off from the trade. Cultural market fairs are on the up as well, where people can eat and drink and buy goods. And if you think of it, the big German market is one of these types of fairs. So we've visited the fair, we've celebrated or hidden from Halloween and trick-or-treaters, and we've warmed ourselves around the bonfire on November the 5th. Now we prepare for Christmas. Many of our Christmas traditions have come to us because of the Victorians. Think of the Christmas tree. Although decorating trees with candles is said to date back to Protestant Christians and Martin Luther in the 16th century. But we also see the Victorians bringing in Christmas cards and carols. And without Dickens, perhaps the Christmas pudding turkey wouldn't be so popular either. Although a goose was certainly the bird of choice for many, even up until the 1950s. But I'd like to take us back a little further, just for a short while. As we know, early Christians realised they'd have a fight on their hands if they attempted to obliterate pagan customs at Christmas time. So they incorporated the pagan Roman feast of Saturnalia, which was around the time of the winter solstice, the 21st of December, and replaced the birthday of the unconquered sun with Christmas Day. From the 25th of December, 12 days were given over to feasting and merriment, the 12 days of Christmas, with 12th night drawing it to a close, although Christmastide wasn't done and dusted until Candlemas, as we heard earlier. First would come Advent, a time of fasting, broken on Christmas Day when festivities would begin with a great feast. Houses would be decorated with greenery consisting of holly, ivy, rosemary and mistletoe. Holly was said to have been used in druidic rituals during the winter solstice because of its evergreen nature, but it also came to represent the crown of thorns and the blood in Christian symbolism. Ivy represented dependence, endurance and faithfulness, linked closely to holly in Christmas imagery. Rosemary was for the Virgin Mary, symbolising her blue cloak because of the blue flowers. I suspect it was also used because of the rather lovely smell. It also has associations with remembrance, particularly of the dead and love. Mistletoe was said to increase life and fertility, and there are many legends connected to this parasitic but rather lovely plant. Certainly we can date stories back to Norse culture. The church didn't hold with mistletoe. It was seen as far too pagan, and possibly they feared it might cause licentious behaviour. Didn't stop mistletoe being used though, and custom was that mistletoe must not touch the ground from cutting down to taking down as the last of the Christmas greens at Candlemas. The Tudors would fashion a kissing bough of this winter greenery, which would be hung in the house, and yes, kisses would be exchanged beneath. Incidentally, I think they hang a kissing bough at Kenilworth Castle still, being as though the castle was given to Dudley by Elizabeth I. And the tradition of holly and mistletoe is still going fairly strong, I would think. We have a tree now, I suppose, instead of greenery. Of the actual 12 days of Christmas, I can account for only the odd one. Christmas Day, which we know of. Boxing Day, still celebrated in my house. But remember good King Wenceslas first looking out on the feast of Stephen. And traditionally a day for money to be given to the poor. Apparently the 5th day, which is our New Year's Eve, was celebrated with games and sporting competitions, archery and etc. But 12th night was the final raucous fling. A great cake would be baked and iced for 12th night, and inside would be placed a bean for the Lord and a pea for the Queen. Cake would be served to guests of the feasts as they entered. The male who ended up with the bean was crowned the Lord of Misrule, and the lady who found the pea, well, she was the Queen of the Pea. The Lord of Misrule would celebrate and would command the happenings of the evening. This practice was particularly popular during the Tudor era. With Protestantism, the feast began to wane. Protestants did away with many of the holy days, and this celebration on the eve of the Epiphany, when the three kings presented gifts to Jesus, may have suffered for this reason. But the 12th night carried on being celebrated as a secular feast, and the cake endured, at least for a few more centuries, though the bean and the pea evolved to trinkets such as charms and thimbles, and would eventually switch over to the Christmas pud instead. Incidentally, during the medieval and Tudor period, the 12th night cake would have been like a fruit-laden brioche or panettone. Only later would it become like our traditional Christmas cake, elaborately iced with almond paste and icing.
We never had poultry at Christmas, to my knowledge. We always had beef. Yes, never had poultry. Well, I don't think those days there was so much of having poultry, really. We used to have, of course, rabbits. But it was a funny thing, none of us were really keen on rabbits. But we had to eat it because, you know, our dad would go out and perhaps kill a rabbit, or when they had harvest time, you know, the rabbits were about, and we used to have one then. Yes, I can remember that. But we weren't, none of us were keen on rabbit. We got to eat it, because there was not much else. All we had at Christmas in our stocking was an orange and a new penny and chocolate pennies. And what else? Perhaps we had an apple. But you see, if we had anything big, we had to have clothing, of course. Shoes or something like that. Yes. We never had a lot at Christmas.
So I can't not mention Christmas puddings. The pudding we know today began life as a pottage. This was a kind of broth which included raisins and other dried fruit, spices and wine. It was thickened with breadcrumbs or ground almonds. It wasn't dissimilar to the mince pie of yesteryear, and both would have included meat or at least meat stock. This plum pottage would be served at the start of the meal rather than at the end. It was not until the end of the 17th century that pottage took on a more solid appearance. It was served like porridge or cooked inside a skin, like a sausage. Even then, it was more likely to have been sliced and cooked under a roasting joint and served alongside the main meal or as a starter, not a dessert. It would be the Victorians who raised its prominence at the festive table as the dessert of choice. We tend to think of Victorians as being quite prim and proper, but most believe Christmas should be celebrated, though many frowned upon excessive drinking and frolicking, and the fact that they frowned upon it meant that the frolicking must have been very evident. It was they who established the tradition of making the Christmas pudding on Stir-up Sunday, the 5th Sunday before Christmas. Stir-up Sunday, after all, was a family affair. Each family member was supposed to stir the mixture from east to west to honour the journey of the Magi. This ritual was also thought to bring the family luck in the coming year, and I wonder whether it sort of is the original stirring and then making a wish. It was customary to hide a number of small trinkets in the mixture. Remember the 12th night cake? These charms often included a silver coin, which signified wealth to come, and a ring to represent a future marriage. If you stumbled across a thimble in your piece of pud, well, that meant certain spinsterhood. Christmas isn't Christmas without the pud. Love it or hate it. Rich or poor, every Victorian would expect a pudding as the finale to their Christmas meal. But what about the ubiquitous mince pie? Under the heading of Ancient Custom, and written in a very small notebook that we hold at the Record Office, it says, mince pies at Christmas were originally made as spices to commemorate the wise men bringing frankincense, etc. Their shape was the coffin form, to be like the manger in which the infant Jesus lay. Mince pies are thought to be medieval in origin and made of an inedible pastry with pre-boiled meat, spices and dried fruit. The poor may well have eaten the casing as well. This savoury and sweet mixture was not unusual, and it was pretty well much this way up until the 18th century. Originally, because they were so costly to buy and make, they were only served on important feast days such as Easter and Christmas. The pies would have been baked in a rectangular shape, hence recalling the shape of the manger, and then it would develop so that dough effigies of baby Jesus were placed on top to reinforce the religious connection, and presumably why it became associated more so with Christmas. Incidentally, some believe the mince pie was banned by Oliver Cromwell, but that isn't strictly true, although the Puritans would probably have frowned upon the use of a dough Jesus, which they would have seen as idolatrous. By the end of the 17th century, mince pies were made in the round casing that we know today, and no baby was to be found, but I have noticed people putting stars on top these days. Meat was still used until quite recently in some parts of the country, and in fact I think there are various parts that still do it now. We seem to have lost a great many of our feasts when communities came together for a truly riotous time. But if we think about it, quite a few of these traditions have survived. My family still does Stir-up Sunday, although to be honest we do it on a Friday evening. My dad still goes holly picking, and I get a sprig to put on my mantelpiece, but I'm not allowed to bring it in until Christmas Eve, and there it stays on the mantelpiece until 12th night. Most of us probably still have pancakes on Shrove Tuesday, and a brave few of us might join a very dangerous game of football. Some celebrate Harvest Festival, and I think most of us will have visited a fair at some point in our lives. In any event, I hope you enjoyed hearing about these festivities and decide that in the light of this quite horrible year, that once we get the opportunity to do so, we'll get out there and celebrate these traditions all the more gloriously as soon as we can. Thank you so much for listening.